The White House says President Trump is serious about acquiring Greenland. He is ready to pay or to even use military force to get it. But any such action may lead to a major rift with allies and even lead to the breakup of the NATO alliance. Now, Trump insists that US needs Greenland for the national security reasons. The melting Arctic ice has created new corridors around the world's biggest island. In 2024, it lost 2.5 million liters of fresh water per second. Russia and China have increased military activities nearby, while White House says that Trump is studying an offer to buy Greenland as well.
The president has been very open and clear with all of you and with the world that he views it in the best interest of the United States to deter Russian and Chinese aggression in the Arctic region. And so that's why his team is currently talking about what a potential purchase would look like.
Both Greenland and Denmark have made it clear that the island is not for sale. But there is precedent. The US had bought what are now the US Virgin Islands from Denmark back in 1917 for $25 million in gold. In today's rates, that will be over $600 million. Denmark had initially resisted the deal, but agreed after the United States threatened to apply force. After the Second World War, US President Harry Truman had made his own offer to buy Greenland, but that was rebuffed. Trump has repeatedly refused to rule out force to seize Greenland, infuriating allies Denmark and Europe. European leaders, including in France and Germany, have announced they are working on a plan in the event the US follows through on its threat.
On Greenland, allow me to be clear. Greenland belongs to its people. Nothing can be decided about Denmark and about Greenland without Denmark or without Greenland. They have the full support and solidarity of the European Union. Europe will remain a firm and unwavering champion of international law and multilateralism.
If any invasion or even a Venezuela-like operation takes place, Denmark's forces are duty-bound to retaliate, even if they don't have orders to do it. A 1952 Danish royal standing order, it's a royal decree that states that its forces must immediately engage the enemy without waiting for specific orders, even without a formal declaration of war, if there is any attempt at an invasion. However, Denmark's military strength pales in comparison to the US. The total strength of the Danish army is approximately 7,000 to 9,000 professional troops. And in addition to the army, it has a number of reservists. It has just 30 fighter planes and no attack helicopters. It is a member of NATO, no doubt, and that means members are bound to help it. Now, if US takes the invasion route, it may lead to a collapse of NATO. In such a case, one option could be Europe expelling US forces from the alliance. Retired French General Mikhail Yakovlev says that Europe does not have the means to go to war with the US, but Europe may kick them out of key bases. US forces have been stationed and they have been deployed across Europe since the end of the Second World War. More than 40 US military bases span the continent. A bulk of the bases are concentrated in Central Europe, primarily in Germany, Italy, Poland, and the United Kingdom. And since the start of the Russia-Ukraine war, number of US troops in Europe has ranged anywhere between 75,000 to over 100,000. Washington already has a military presence in Greenland. The Pituffik base currently houses some 150 personnel. The US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, will be meeting Danish officials next week to discuss Greenland. When asked whether US was willing to risk the NATO alliance by potentially moving ahead with a military option, Rubio did not directly answer that, but stated that Trump had been talking about acquiring Greenland since his first term back in 2019. All right, now to discuss this further and get in all the perspectives, we're now being joined on the broadcast by Professor David Dunn, Professor of International Politics in the Department of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Birmingham. And I'm also joined by Dr. Glenn Diesen, Professor of International Relations at the University of Southeastern Norway, joining us from Oslo. Dr. Diesen, let me start with you. Is there now a full-fledged possibility, or is there going to be a reality waiting to happen, that the US takes over Greenland? Is a military intervention to be ruled out, just being considered as a rhetoric, or is there more weight behind it? What are the options for the US?
Well, it's obviously very possible, and that's quite clear from the American rhetoric. Now, I do think, though, that the rhetoric of using military force is still unlikely, but it's still possible. I think the US has many ways to go about this. Either they use military force in terms of an actual invasion, but that could have a lot of consequences. And Trump is more a president of low-hanging fruit. He likes to get away with something cheap. So it's more likely that there will be this effort, will threat to use military force, but then instead offer to buy it, because the Europeans will know if there is use of military force, the Danes will get nothing, and the NATO will be broken. So it's better if you threaten use of force and then have the Danes instead take the money, so they can then at least get something and also keep NATO. As a third option, of course, they can also use NGOs and other instruments to essentially stage a democratic revolution, similar to what they did in Ukraine, because once Greenland is broken from Denmark, it will be easier to absorb thereafter. So, but I do think the US has set its mind on it wants Greenland, but to what extent it's willing to go, it's very unpredictable, this administration.
Understood. Glenn Deason, stay with me. Let me go over to Professor Dunn now. Professor, you've heard Dr. Deason. He's not ruling out the actual possibility of military intervention from the US. You see it in a slightly different manner. I'll toss it over to you. What are your views on Greenland?
Well, I think that what the ambiguity from the White House is a part of is an attempt to take a maximalist stand in order to try and strengthen their bargaining position in their demands for Greenland. Of course, the position is still outrageous because of that. I mean, it's incontrovertible that in an age of melting ice caps, there needs to be an improvement in the security around Greenland. But that's entirely consistent with the 1951 treaty between Denmark and the United States. So there's no problem of beefing up the security. Similarly, there's no problem in terms of access to the mineral wealth or oil wealth that's in Greenland. What the problem is that this idea that we want to buy it, and we demand to have it, and that is politically problematic, and it's unlikely to amount to a military force. It's unlikely to be a military clash, because it would be unwise of the Danish forces there to engage their American counterparts. And therefore, if there was to be any military declaration, or that the military presence there is now establishing American ownership, it would just be an illegal ownership. And I think actually the way in which the Danish and the Europeans in general will seek to play this, will seek to actually delay any American action and to hope that actually once the midterm elections happen in November, that Congress stops any precipitative access by the administration. But it's not a good look. I mean, if for one country with an alliance to actually be threatening a fellow member of that alliance, that is hugely problematic. And I think, and that's the sense in which people talk about the end of NATO. It's not the end of NATO as a military alliance as such. I don't think that would happen. I think instead it's about the nature of the alliance will be changed.
All right, I hear your point. Dr. Deason, Professor Dunn is ruling out any kind of a military intervention. He doesn't see NATO cracking up. It will remain an alliance. I want to now just get your perspective on what options Europe has. Will they be expelling US forces from Europe? Can they resort to some kind of, there is also this reiteration of the royal decree in Denmark since 1952. What kind of a message is that sending to Trump? Because the joint statement was out and then they revert to this decree, which suggests that they can retaliate without direct orders. What do you make of that? What are the options with Europe?
Well, just to clarify, I don't think it's likely they will use military force, but I don't rule it out. Okay. And I don't really disagree with the position either that this might be a maximalist approach to begin with. They did the same to Panama. They said they would annex the Panama Canal, and they start off with this hard opening position, and at the end of it, Panama accepts that it will walk away a bit from the China's Belt and Road Initiative and give preferential access to the United States. So it could simply be a negotiation tactic. On the other hand, I don't think you should underestimate Trump's contempt for the Europeans. You've seen it in his rhetoric, but also in the new national security strategy. But the problem is if you use military force, if I was advising Trump, the concern is due to the polarized political climate in the United States, the next administration might reverse it to patch things up with the Europeans. So it's better to get a sale instead, something that get the consent of the Europeans or the Danes and the at least, and then from this point make it more permanent. In terms of what the Europeans can do, I don't think they can do much, to be honest. I know they're making threats so far, but that's just as a way of deterring. But if the US goes in, I don't think they would do much. The problem for the Europeans is that they made themselves excessively dependent on the United States for two reasons. Militarily, by making an enemy out of Russia, they allowed themselves to become too dependent on the US, to the extent the US can even destroy Europe's energy infrastructure, and we do nothing. We stand by, and this, of course, has consequences. And the second is economic. Economic parity is gone, and the Europeans are isolating themselves from Russia, China, to some extent even in India now by bowing to US pressure. This amount of dependence results in a lot of US power.
I hear your point. Professor Dunn, Dr. Deason is not ruling out a military intervention, but he does suggest that Europe, they have limited options with them. They're too dependent on the US militarily and even economically. What's your take? What are the options with Europe?
Yeah, I agree. The biggest priority, as far as most European states and most members of NATO are concerned, is deterring Russia from attacking more parts of Europe, parts of the former Soviet Union, the Baltic states in particular. It's about keeping the Americans on board and supporting, as they are, Ukraine in its attempt to actually stop the further parts of its territory being invaded. And that is a priority over the question of Denmark. And so even though Europeans are outraged by the American demands and they are trying to resist them, the bigger picture is that actually European security and American contribution to European security is more important than Denmark. And even if there were to be Denmark to say we're leaving NATO, that would mean that Denmark left NATO rather than European NATO kicking America out of NATO. There's no means to kick anybody out of NATO. States can leave under Article 14. Understood. But most of Eastern Europe would stay with NATO because they regard that as more important than Denmark.
Understood. Professor Dunn and Dr. Deason both made some very pertinent points. It is clear that on one side they have a bigger threat from Russia, but what perhaps Europe did not account for was some kind of pressure, and this kind of pressure coming in from their own biggest ally, militarily at least, and economically now, the US. But between the two, they would need to ensure that they are secured against Russia. And if someone has to leave, perhaps Denmark leaving would be a bigger chance than the US. That's what Professor Dunn mentioned. What happens next? We'll need to wait and watch. This is very quickly. It is evolving very fast, and we will be tracking those closely. Thank you to both my guests for joining us.
Thank you.